I think we're live. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Manitoba Chambers of Commerce Manitoba Pulley Power Hour series presented by 6P Marketing. My name is Peggy May, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Southport Aerospace Centre in Portage la Prairie and outgoing Chair of the Manitoba Chambers of Commerce. I'm pleased to be hosting today's in-depth provincial budget presentation featuring Honourable Scott Fielding, Minister of Finance. Our vision for the Manitoba Pulley Power Hour series is to offer opportunities to open dialogue with elected officials and government policymakers and to connect our members with change agents to help shape a strong future for our province. We would definitely prefer to be networking and connecting in person in a conference room for this annual budget event, but nonetheless, thank you for supporting the Manitoba Chambers of Commerce as we've shifted into this virtual world. I will formally introduce Minister Fielding shortly, but before we get started, I wanted to share a few budget remarks on behalf of the Manitoba Chamber. Clearly, this budget is not going to be like any other we've seen in Manitoba's recent history. The focus right now is to protect Manitobans through the ongoing pandemic. And to that end, we see $1.18 billion worth going toward COVID-19 costs, including personal protective equipment, vaccine deployment, education supports, and future needs. We are also very pleased to see increased healthcare investments as well as funding for Manitoba's mental health to combat addictions and for housing support. As residents, we're happy with tax rollbacks and the planned phase out of education property taxes. But as a business association, our priority is Budget 2021's second focus, the advancement of jobs and economic recovery post-COVID-19. Manitoba's economic outlook indicates a strong rebound in 2021, followed by another solid year in 2022. And Manitoba Chambers of Commerce is dedicated to supporting our business community and driving this growth. Budget 2021 includes more than $62 million to help businesses retrain employees and develop e-commerce platforms. And we know that's where we will invest our time and efforts and affect the greatest change. I don't want to steal any of the minister's thunder, so I'll stop there, but I do have a few housekeeping items. We've muted all participants for best audio quality. Minister Fielding will have approximately 45 minutes, maybe not that long, to deliver his budget remarks and accompanying slides. Then we'll move into a brief Q&A moderated by Manitoba Chambers of Commerce President and CEO Chuck Davidson. If a question arises during the minister's presentation, please feel free to type it into the Zoom Q&A, and Chuck will try to manage those in real time. I'd like to take an opportunity to acknowledge today's sponsors. First, our Manitoba Pulley Power Hour presenting sponsor, 6P Marketing. Pre-pandemic, 6P helped us level our networking and learning events with an ongoing series investment, and they delivered our brand new website in 2020. Most recently, their team has been working feverishly to develop an online platform for us called Manitoba Business Matters. You might have seen the slide at the beginning of the presentation. A microsite which will help us share economic recovery information with Manitoba organizations as we move through 2021. We look forward to going live with this platform very soon so we can continue to provide excellent COVID-related resources and information from expert partners to our members and the broader business community. Next, today's event sponsors, Rogers and Manitoba Egg Farmers. We are truly grateful for your investments in Manitoba and for your commitment to the Chamber of Commerce network across the province. Partnerships with your organizations enable us to serve our members well through events like today, where we can authentically and directly engage with one another. So thank you, Rogers and Manitoba Egg Farmers, for supporting today's webinar. And now to introduce today's keynote speaker. Minister Fielding was elected as MLA for Kirkfield Park in 2016 and 2019. He graduated from the University of Manitoba with an advanced Bachelor of Arts in Economic and Political Studies, and previously served as a Winnipeg City Councillor, where he was the chair of the Finance Committee and chair of the Winnipeg Police Board. A business owner, he has served on boards of organizations including the Winnipeg Convention Centre, the Assiniboine Park Conservancy, and the St. James Village Business Improvement Zone. Minister, the floor is yours.
Well, great. Thanks. I hope everyone can hear me well out there. And I just want to first we get started. I want to recognize thanks to the sponsors for making events like this possible. So it's fantastic. You're stepping up, Rogers, and folks from as well as others. And I also want to personally thank yourself as well as Chuck Davidson. Through the pandemic, we really had to reach out to the business community in a lot of different ways to model some of our programming and supports. And Chuck has been he's been excellent in terms of, all the business lobbies and really provides, I think, a kind of a thorough look at things and represents his members, needs and what he's hearing effectively. And he's someone that, we listen to quite a bit. So I just want to thank Chuck for all the work that you're doing in your association. So really want to touch base with our budget. We're very excited. We've got a bit of a slide deck. There's a lot of slides, but I'm going to try and roll through them pretty quickly. So really what budget 2021 really focuses in on is really protecting Manitobans and advancing Manitoba in so many different ways. And that's, it's important to really address to protect Manitobans, as well as take a look at the future, what the post-pandemic we'll take a look at. If you look at our budget focus, first of all, we did budget consultations this year. There's about 51,000 people that participated. We generally go around the whole, province and, kind of hear from different regions and stuff. This year, we had to do it a little bit differently, as most things are happening differently this year. So we did virtual, we did town hall meetings, telephone town hall meetings, and all totaled, we had, again, 51,000 individuals. Really, our budget really focuses, on sustaining our COVID response, continuing to invest in priority areas that Manitobans have really identified, making life a little bit more affordable, not just for residents, but for businesses, and advancing Manitoba and restoring a fiscal balance. That's in the future years, and that's really important. This is the next is a kind of a slide for the most part that looks at the Manitoba economy, $71 billion economy. This is a slide that the bond rating agencies love to look at because we're a very diverse province. As you can see, there's a variety of subsectors. I think there's 15 subsectors that make up more than 5% of our GDP in so many different ways. So we're not like Alberta, where you're seeing a boom and bust if the price of oil goes down or what have you. There's impacts. There's really strength in times of economic downturn. If you look at our history, and Manitoba's the most diverse economy, and generally we do a little bit better than other jurisdictions because of this diversity. So that's an important marker. I also thought as we go through this, I'm going to go through a bit with the economy, and then we're going to turn into the budget. But I thought it's good, kind of a reflection, and you can tell me if that's what you're seeing as well. These are all based on Stats Canada and Manitoba Bureau of Statistics information. But Manitoba's diversity economy really impacted a little bit better than other provinces. During the pandemic, we lost about 90,000 jobs. A lot of those have come back. Unemployment rate jumped to about 11.4%. Retail sales, of course, when the shutdowns happened, dropped by 26%. Manufacturing, at least the first part of it, dropped by 18%. And as we probably know, through the K kind of shaped recovery, I guess, if you will, tourism and accommodation services, restaurants, these were really hard hit industries just because of the nature of their business. In terms of the economy, it saw momentum from a large number of capital projects and government support. So, again, our unemployment rate, went to about 8% in 2020. That's the highest it has been since the 90s recession that we were here, but it was the lowest amongst all the provinces in Canada. So that's kind of a good sign, although way too many people unemployed. Capital spending on things like buildings increased by about 13%. International exports went up by about 81%. That's more on food processing and that sorts to places like China and Japan. Exports to the United States actually dropped by about 10%, but it was all offset by other imports and exports rather. COVID-19 generally was an uneven impact on multiple sectors in the economy, as you probably know. The next slide really kind of demonstrates some of the areas, again, kind of goes through the industries that did well and others that didn't do as well. Restrictions resulted in reduced spending in things like clothing and travel, arts and entertainment, food and beverage. Some sectors, again, saw some growth in financial sectors, things like education services, tech companies, and again, accommodation services were the most impacted. So again, some were there. I think one of the learnings we probably have with this pandemic and supports our businesses, there's a lot of broad-based support, and I think probably as we move forward, more sector-driven support is where we think, and I think most provinces are looking to go now. In terms of manufacturing, obviously one of the biggest sectors in Manitoba, seeing really unprecedented long-term capital investments supported by government incentives. Manufacturing saw about a $2 billion increase in new capital investments, and we were leading the country actually in private sector capital investment. A lot of these projects you're very familiar of, downward, and if anyone is, looks at the new Beyond Meat or Beyond, when you get a burger from A&W, wherever it is, how important roquette pea production or other, kind of food productions is really skyrocketed over the last number of years, which is an important not even emerging, is manufacturing that's really important to the province. We provide a lot of tax incentives. This year, it was upwards of $55 million or $65 million in a manufacturing tax incentive credit. So you get the GST back on certain elements. Look at our economic outlook. And so this is based on 9 different forecasting agencies. We take kind of a medium approach to them, and some are higher, some are lower. So this is an average. We see GDP growth by going about 4.1% this year, 3.6% in 2022. Unemployment rates, again, 6.9% in 21, dropping to about 6% in 22. Now this, of course, is, there's a lot of variables here, right? I mean, if we have a third wave that looks to be coming our way, it's certainly hit the other parts of the country, that would impact these numbers potentially too. You might see an uptick on those numbers later on down the line. Turning more towards our budgets in the Manitoba economy, for the most part, this budget, when you look at revenues, expenditures, our revenue growth is projected to grow by about $361 million or 2.1%, kind of a moderate level of revenue growth, I guess I would say. And so it is rebounding a little bit. Our expenditures, if you look at kind of from budget day last year, that was prior to the pandemic happening. Actually, the first stat is kind of from our third quarter report to now. So our projected decrease by about $122 million from last year. But if you go budget to budget, I guess that was prior to the COVID hitting, it's increased our budgets by about 8.2%. And as you can see, total expenditures are in the realm of $19.4 billion. The next slide kind of outlines where we are year to date. So our fiscal year end obviously is March, end of March. And so this is where the first on the left really identifies what we're looking at as a deficit this year. The blue is the number we're tracking towards after Q3. We come out with our what we call our public accounts by year end. That will happen closer to the end of summer. But if you look at the green shades, these are revenues that we've lost because of COVID-19 through corporate and personal income taxes, as well as expenditures. So we've expended about $1.9 billion that we didn't anticipate initially to support businesses, individual people, health, education, you name it. The loss of revenue actually would have been greater, but we did strike a partnership agreement with the federal government for kind of additional about $600 million in supports. This $600 million is significant, but it only represents about 20% of the spend that we had, because overall we spent about $3.2 billion over this year, next year. If you look at the slide to the right, we're anticipating this year the budget deficit to come in at $1.597 billion. And again, we've lost some revenues. You look at the green, $180 million from revenues that we anticipate from the COVID. And we're going to invest about $1.1 billion in COVID release. We're going to go through what money we put away to address any future waves and all that sorts of stuff to make sure we're prepared. The two later blue slides on both sides suggest last year, if we actually factored out our COVID expenditures, we actually would have been a bit of a modest surplus. It'd be about $157 million surplus when you factor out all the COVID expenditures. This year would have been a bit of a deficit, about $197 million when you factor out the COVID expenditures. Look at our next slide. It talks about meeting our budget targets. And this is a slide we're really proud of. We outperformed our budget each and every year. The green is a good marker where we're overperforming of what we first came out with the budget and where we landed at year end. So we're meeting our targets. First balanced budget. Last year we had a balanced budget, 4 years ahead of schedule, by the way. About a $5 million surplus last year. That was prior to COVID hitting. You might recall, obviously hit it in March. The red is bad, but the red is support that's very much needed this year. I think probably Manitobans will give us a pass this year, as every government has had to make billions of dollars of expenditure growth for Manitobans. This is an outlook forecast for us. So we've got a plan to balance our budget back in about 8 years. We think it's a doable plan to get ourselves back into balance in a reasonable time frame. As you can see from the red, which is this current fiscal year that just ended, but the results will come out later on summer, tracking towards a $2 billion deficit, drops down again this year, about 1.597, which we tabled yesterday. And as you can see, we see it as kind of a COVID deficit. And what we mean about that is these are expenditures that are built in. Now, if the COVID kind of continued on past the end of this fiscal year, these numbers could change. But as you can see, the numbers go down to $374 million and just over $200 million in the future years, which is kind of striking distance from balancing your budget. What is important about this, and could be a question later on down the line, is people say, well, why are you making some tax changes this year when you're running a pretty good deficit? Well, again, so we see this as a COVID deficit in those first 2 years. We get to some moderate level of deficit, back on track, I guess I would say in year 3. So we do think that providing some tax relief now makes sense for individuals and businesses. And again, we do see it as a COVID deficit that pulling to normal levels, in year 3. When you look at things of our borrowing capacity, so this is areas that look at the amount of debt we're taking on. This year, it's about $5.7 billion, really made up of hydro debt, $1.2 billion. It's finishing off the Keyas generating station, as well as refinancing of some debt for about $2.7 billion. Net debt to GDP, kind of a wonkish term that the bond rating agencies look to see how much debt you're taking on. And for the most part, it's gone to about 39.9. It was about 34.2. That's an impact, obviously, of COVID. A lot of other provinces are probably around 50% or so. Now, again, this is overall, this is our net debt to GDP. You look at the other, kind of to the right side of the slide, really takes on the gross debt. So right now we're about 54 billion. That includes hydro debt of about $24 billion. Now, some of the forecasts or some of the debt, the agencies, rather the bond rating agencies, consider hydro self-sustaining. So that means basically the revenues they're bringing in, you don't have to attach it to your debt load when they take a look at these things. Some agencies think it is, some isn't, but overall that's the gross debt. And debt servicing charges are about just $1 billion. That's actually a little bit down because interest rates have gone down, but for the most part we've taken on more borrowing. What that means is that's $1 billion that we can't spend on health or education or social services or anything else because we're paying debt servicing charges. So we need to address the deficit, but right now it's time to really focus in on protecting Manitobans. We also think that spending in priority areas, we clearly heard that from Manitobans in our budget consultation process. So year over year expenditures, if you look kind of the top right, we're making year over year, this doesn't include the COVID expenditures. We've put that to the side, which we're going to go through a little bit later on. But year over year, we're increasing our health budget by about $156 million. Education, when you mix in both advanced education, like post-secondary and education, about $91 million. And families' budgets going up by about $33 million. Collectively on the bottom, it shows how much more each and every year we're spending in the healthcare system, $750 million more than when we first came to office each and every year, $441 million in the education system, and $238 million in kind of the social services or the families area. So collectively, we're spending about 1.4, almost 1.5 billion more each and every year on these priority areas for Manitobans. Now, the focal point, obviously, for the budget is to protect Manitobans in so many different ways. We launched this a little bit early. We're investing about $1.1 billion in COVID supports. The chart on the right kind of just shows you where we're spending our money. Mainly it's in things like PPE, testing, contact tracing, and vaccine site infrastructures. That's about $230 million. The second is the vaccine program. That's about $100 million. And we anticipate those are pretty aggressive numbers. We have a lot of money built in here. Education system, about $160 million. So that's money to give to the school systems to address COVID related issues, right? You're hiring more staff, if you're cleaning, all that sorts of stuff that the costs are there. We also have built in $350 million for health systems. So this is if we get a third or fourth wave of COVID-19, right? So it allows us to surge. A surge capacity costs you money to do as such. That's a pretty good amount of money that we built into the budget here. I don't think we'll use all that, but and also a contingency, we've got $300 million. The one thing we know about the pandemic is we can't judge it because it seems to change with variants and a whole bunch of other things that happen. So we built in about $300 million of contingency. This will also take in consideration to do other business supports for agencies and all that sorts of stuff. So it's a good amount of money that is built into the system. And it's really based on what we spent last year. We got about a year now of tracking of COVID expenditures. So it's based on what we spent last year. We've also preloaded a lot of things. So for instance, we've got like a year's supply of PPE, masks and gloves and all those types of things. We preloaded our costs for our super centers to rent the convention center, both in Brandon and Winnipeg and other areas beforehand. So there's a lot of built-in costs that are already baked into numbers we paid for last year. In terms of healthcare, again, we're increasing the budget by $156 million. We're making a commitment to what we call our clinical and preventive service plan. So it's an emphasis to really keep healthcare in the communities that you may live in, Brandon or the north or other areas, instead of always coming into Winnipeg that costs you money and time. And so we're making a capital investment This last year was going to be about $260 million. That's for capital upgrades for things like hospitals and other things. This is up to about 812 million. And so Minister Stephenson will be addressing this and giving you more details in the coming weeks of where we're making those further enhancements, investments in hospitals and other things that will be coming up. So that's a lot of capital dollars to make sure we're getting healthcare closer to home. We're also dedicating $50 million for a lot of the wait times, a lot of the surgeries that had been put off. So these are major surgeries, as well as things like hip, knee, and cataract types of surgery. So $50 million, $23 million for cancer treatment, and about $2.7 million for expanded dialysis treatments. Is going to help about 200 more patients. And also we established a new program for continuous glucose monitoring devices for people under the age of 25. That's a big issue for parents, making sure kids, their blood sugar levels are right. And so there was a very effective campaign by parents. And so we really decided to look forward, and we made a program for it. In terms of mental health and addictions, we know that everyone has been stressed. That's one thing that everyone can say about the pandemic had similar to everyone else's. We initially started a new department, the Department of Mental Health, Wellness, and Recovery. Initially did a funding of $342 million for programming and services. There's 27 different initiatives we've entered into. We had initially a Virgo report that kind of gave us a roadmap where we spend. Made some additional investments, $1.7 million for mental health and addiction strategies this year, $1.8 million for 24/7 housing supports for individuals. And Minister Gordon, who's the minister responsible for it, we allocated $5 million. She's going to be consulting throughout the province to know what other supports we should have put in place, and there's some programming dollars that will be there. In terms of the education system, our K through 12 system, we're investing about $3 billion in that. That's the third highest on a per capita basis per pupil across all of the country. So we are investing some good money there. We are reforming the education system. We've got a Better Education Starts Today strategy to support education funding. So we think that there's too much money being spent at the administrative level, and we want to make sure that money gets to the classroom and get better results. Our results aren't very good right now. And so if we can spend less money in kind of administration through some of the school divisions, and there's been some good work that's happened, but we've done two things. Number one, we've made kind of a collective bargaining instead of all the divisions doing kind of bargaining with teachers and other staff. We've done it collectively, so there's a lot less work that school trustees will be doing, as well as other factors that are there. We took away the ability to tax. That makes up about 80% of their job. So they've done a great job, but we want to make sure the money gets into the classrooms. $4 million for virtual learning strategies, about $5.5 million for special needs funding. And we've really enhanced our schools. We got a commitment to build 20 new schools across the province. And we are spending about $160 million. We put $100 million more to really enhance that, get the schools built sooner. So we think it's really important investments to make. In terms of Manitoba families, this is our social service department. We're increasing the funding by about $34 million. And that's really made up of a number of areas for vulnerable individuals. Things like early learning and childcare, about $4 million more. That supports $1.6 million for operating grants for childcare centers, and about 541 new spots for parents, working parents, especially during the pandemic. It's really important to make sure working families have the spots. We've also done things like a childcare development tax credit that gives businesses about $10,000 per spot to maybe build a childcare center right in their facility and make it easier for working families. We also increased the rent assist budget. So that is a program for lower income individuals, and it helps you pay for some of your rent. And what the good thing about this is you get immediacy, you get the money right off the bat. You can choose where you want to live. You don't have to wait for someone to build a Manitoba housing unit. You can take your money and really go where you want. What we've done this year is we really enhanced the amount of money that's going to individuals. So depending on your the type and the size of your family, for the most part, it's going up by about 11%. So it's something to really address poverty. We've had some pretty good numbers in terms of reductions in poverty related, as you can see down below, about an 18% overall drop in poverty. And child poverty, we used to be the child poverty capital of Canada, and we've actually dropped it since coming to office by about 25%. And a lot of people really associate it with this rent assist program, kind of a portable shelter benefit, because it gives more money to people in their pockets. We've also increased the community living disability service budget by about $12.5 million. In terms of policing, public safety, we've obviously with the pandemic, there's been a backlog in our court systems. And so we've allocated almost $3 million to catch up on the backlogs. We've developed a new criminal intelligence center. That's really helped to disrupt kind of criminal activity that's happening. Also more investment dollars, $815,000 to help support victims of crime and increase supports for the family violence and families of murdered, missing women and girls. And about $1.2 million for restorative justice types of initiatives for First Nations and Métis communities. We also have made investments in public safety communication systems. So it's going to, we've made an investment of the capital dollars with municipalities, about 16.5 million. This is to get better emergency services. As you may recall, and other tragedies that have happened, whether it be tornadoes and everything else, we haven't had a really good communication system in Manitoba. So we made a capital investments like $400 million or so. And this pays for the operating component of that to make sure that emergency systems and communications is better in rural and northern communities. In terms of protecting our environment and natural resources, our parks are really important to us. We made a $20 million endowment fund for our parks to really modernize our parks. Our parks certainly aren't for sale, but we want to modernize them to make them effective. People love going to the parks, and just we need to modernize them a little bit. So we think this endowment fund is a step in the right direction. We did a conservation and climate fund. We increased it by about $400,000 to $1 million to fund projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. A new $1 million organic green impact bond, first of its kind in Manitoba. We really like this. We think that organics, if you can make some headway in this, it's going to help the environment in so many different ways. We got a climate and green plan implementation office to redevelop kind of a long-term plan. And we also developed a couple of years ago, a conservation and growth trust. And so these are programs on government lands and private letters to really protect wetlands. And so it's helped, again, endowment funds. So it starts to pay for itself in the future years for different programs and initiatives we can use. Also $4 million to protect health and safety in northern communities to improve water and wastewater types of initiatives. In terms of infrastructure, that's a real big focal point. And I think it kind of goes to your initial point of advancing Manitoba. We really see infrastructure as a way to create some great jobs here in our community. We committed as a party to commit about $1.2 billion of spending for kind of what we're calling strategic infrastructure. That's everything from roads to schools to hospital expenditures. This year, we're actually coming in at $2.1 billion. So pretty substantial increase. Last year, we spent about 1.8 million. Consists of about $780 million in roads and highway and bridges, $300 million in health types of initiatives, $101 million for Lake Manitoba, Lake St. Martin Channel. We're trying to get this flood protection built. It's been marred down on consultations, federal environmental protections, but we're going to get this thing done. We got a lot of money built into here. Also some money for education gone through, and things like building the new St. Boniface Emergency Department. We made a commitment this year with the City of Winnipeg for the North End Water, the Pollution Control Center. That's of course working with the City of Winnipeg. So we sent Brian Bowman a letter allocating another $123 million in this budget to fund our second phase of the North End Treatment Center. We're going to continue to work with him. We also, this is the third part, the last part I think is really important. A minimum of $500 million a year for 3 years, kind of a 3-year horizon for the heavy construction industry. That's to fix the roads and bridges and everything else. And if there's any money that's not spent in future years, we've committed to moving it forward and spending it in future years. So that's a really big piece, especially in rural and northern Manitoba, to make sure infrastructure is moved. We also made a lot of tax change measures. We think that Manitobans need a break and businesses need a break. We're looking to phase out the education property taxes that you probably heard, 25% this year and 25% next year. And that will, that's about a $248 million tax rebate, I guess, for Manitobans in so many different ways. So it's really easy to figure this out. For the most part, your school taxes make up about half of your municipal tax bill. So let's say you're paying $4,000 in your school, in your municipal tax bill. It's about $2,000 for your taxes for schools. You're going to get 25% of that back. You get about $500 this year. And then we would double that next year, about $1,000. We're going to send you a check right off the bat. So it's important. We also made some changes on smaller things like retail sales tax and personal services. You're getting your haircuts or salons and that sorts of stuff. The health and post-secondary education. This is the payroll tax. And we last year moved the thresholds up, and we've done that this year as well. So what that's going to mean is it's going to have a really positive impact on about 1,100 businesses. 240 businesses will not have to pay the job-killing payroll tax overall. And again, this is the second year in a row we made some changes there. We think it's important. Also some changes on things that we see as advancing Manitoba, the strategy to build our economy, interactive digital media tax credit. Essentially, there's a lot of add-on types of games. If you've got any kids that play Roblox or, other things, they're probably always asking you for additional add-ons. So this will allow the digital media to allow that under their labor component to build. We also made that permanent. Made some changes in the small business venture tax credit. So that's kind of enhancements to get venture capital happening. Do also want to address the venture capital piece. We've been working with the Premier's Advisory Committee. We very much want to see this move ahead. We think it makes sense. We are still working on the design, I would say, of it, as well as kind of some of the governance. We want to make sure it's right before we roll it out to the public, but we do think it makes sense to look at venture capital processes based on what the Premier's Advisory Committee that's made up. And so we're going to continue to work with the Business Council and Manitoba Chambers and others on that. Film video production credit. So this kind of just stops the clock. There's been some slowdowns with the movie productions. So we're allowing them to kind of continue their credit. Also new teacher expense tax credit. So there's a federal tax credit right now. If teachers, let's say they're buying pens and papers outside of their normal classroom activities, the federal government right now provides a tax credit to them. So up to $1,000, you get $150 back on that. We're matching that. We're going to do that at $150, 15% tax credit on it. Also reducing vehicle registration fees. We reduced it by 10% last year and another 10% this year. Made some changes on, again, some of the tax credit extensions I won't go through. The other is kind of e-commerce. And these are items like online streaming services, online platforms. Maybe if you go on Amazon or one of these, that there's third-party elements, as well as online services. Maybe it's like an Airbnb. So what happens right now, these aren't taxed. And as we move through e-commerce, you probably bought a lot of your stuff online. What happens is if you go down the local street on Academy Avenue or wherever you may live, Daly Street, wherever you live, and you buy some sort of a product, you pay your PST in it. But if you go on the streaming service that's a third party, you're not paying any tax on it. So how fair is that for local business owners? So we did this to level the playing field. The federal government announced that they're introducing the GST on this, so we're matching that. Most provinces have moved in this direction, so that's why we made some changes there. We also engaged in a tax competitiveness review. I know that's what Chuck and other members of the business community have been asking for, so we're excited to work with the business community on that and seeing what tax structures we need to make some changes from over the next number of years. The next slide kind of demonstrates what we committed to in the last election campaign, a 2020 tax rollback. As you can see from the slide, the right part of the slide, we've attained that. We're going to do it over 4 years, but we did it a year earlier than anticipated. So that gives a little bit more money to you back into your wallet, I guess, if you will. Next slide unpacks a little bit more of our education property tax. So again, 25% reduction on residential and farmland properties, a 10% reduction on commercial properties. Again, about $250 million rebate for 658,000 properties. A part of this too, and I guess if you look to the right, if you have an average, and again, I said this, if you've got an average residential property across the province, you'd say about $385. Winnipeg, because the values of land is a little bit higher, it'd be about $480. You'll get a check back for these areas. Whether you're average farmer, about $1,900, or your average business, it's about another $800. What's important as well about this, this is for property owners, but we also decided to make the move of freezing rent guidelines. So there's a rent control in for 2 years. And so, landlords are going to get a pretty good break out of this. It works out to about $160 per door. And if you had rent controls in place, they would get another about 120. So they're going to be ahead of the game. But we think that people that are living lower income levels should get a break as well. So that's why we made improvements to the rent assistance program and frozen rents for a 2-year period that matches our commitment to the education property tax. In terms of advancing jobs and growth, what we're really excited about is a plan going forward post-pandemic. In addition to some of the COVID supports for individuals and households, investments in infrastructure and providing tax relief is really part of it. Big plan to develop skills and talent and supporting innovation and commercialization. That, of course, Manitoba Chambers have been involved with a $50 million fund with Economic Development Winnipeg on what that will look like. And I know there's a plan for digitalization and getting people focused on e-commerce and approaches, and that's really been highlighted through the pandemic. and more sector-specific growth strategies amongst other supports, which are going to go in a little bit more details on. In terms of advancing jobs and growth, reducing taxes, again, we went through all these. These are tax measures that whether you're a business or your individuals, you're going to benefit from. Increasing infrastructure, we think, is a part of the long-term plan for advancing jobs and growth in Manitoba. Supporting jobs and economic growth is $62 million. Part of this is his long-term recovery fund, and part is workforce development dollars. That's in Minister Eichler's department. So that's maybe if businesses need some training supports to help businesses come and grow and prosper here. Generally, it's if businesses come in, it's a bit of an incentive for them to come to Manitoba. We also did youth employment. So we're investing $25 million for wage subsidies for people to hire youth. We did that last year. We hired about 4,000 youth, and that was through the government, through nonprofits and private sector providing a wage subsidy that's there. We want to do that same amount this year. That's the reason why we're about 2.5% kind of lower than the national average in youth unemployment rate. And a part of this, although it's not on the slide, is we did wage subsidies of about $48 million last year. We want to allocate that again for the same sectors for you and the business communities to do it. Also big focus on skill development and training. That's really aligning the post-secondary education with what the labor force needs here in Manitoba, making sure we're providing that. Some more growth and innovation funding, I guess, if you will, for a protein advantage, right? And we went through a little bit before, but there's been so many different investments through Roquette and others. This protein advantage strategy is something that we think we have a competitive advantage on. And again, if anyone eats beyond meat, burgers, or anything else like that, you know what that sector's like. There's real potential to grow there. Also, new independent private sector-led provincial economic development agencies with a single window for businesses, investors. We anticipate probably the venture capital being part of that in so many different ways. And we also want to reduce red tape. So that really outlines a lot of our programs. Really just some final thoughts on it before we get into maybe a question and answer session is, you know, our real focus here was to protect Manitobans. We got a lot of money that's invested in health and education and supports if there's a third wave that comes for the pandemic. You know, I think, and I know Chuck will mention this, you know, the real focus of this is we got to get people vaccinated, right? If we get people vaccinated, you know, you're going to have herd immunity that happens, and we're going to get our lives back a little bit sooner. And we're kind of in a race with the variant right now, and we really need to get more people vaccinated. We've got a lot of money built in here for vaccination centers, but we also want to advance Manitoba and look past the pandemic, how we're going to grow our economy. And we think that's the way we're going to get out of deficit, by growing the pie, bringing in more funding. And that really consists of really our plans moving forward. We also made some changes. We had a rainy day built up budget. We were pretty proud of that. We had about $800 million. We used some of it last year, about $215 million. We withdrew from the rainy day fund to support the Bridge Grant program. That, of course, supported about 15,000 businesses, gave them about $15,000 of unencumbered money to support them. Now, what this does is it doesn't have an impact on your deficit one way or the other. What it does, it allowed us to draw money that we had sitting around. We still have about $585 million left. But instead of going to capital markets and borrowing money, you know, at a 2.1% interest rate on a 10-year bond, which costs you maybe $45 million over a 10-year period, we're able to use money from the rainy day fund. So we're able to save $45 million. We got an appropriate amount of money left over to address any forest fires, floods, you know, further needs with the pandemic. And so we think it's responsible. So that really kind of highlights kind of our budget, I guess, in a nutshell. There's lots of information, and I'll hand it back over to you, Chuck. And if there's any questions, I'd love to answer them for you.
Minister Fielding, thank you very much for taking the time. We've got about 15 to 20 minutes that we'll hammer through some questions. And I really appreciate you taking the time with us today. This is your third provincial budget. Last year, and I'll always remember last year's as well, because you were scheduled to speak to us pretty much the day COVID hit Manitoba. And so we never got to have that speech, which would have been our last one in person at a breakfast event. And we had an entire room was going to be filled with about 400 people to come and hear you speak. And we never got to do that. And then this year we have to do it virtually. And so I want to talk a little bit just in terms of just to kind of get us kind of rolling. You know, typically the path that government had been in and that you'd been in this role had been really about restoring the finances of Manitoba. And that's something I know that you talk a lot about. But I want to know, just in terms of, as you were developing this budget specifically, can you talk about sort of that different mindset that you had to take as finance minister, recognizing we're not going to be balancing the budget at all, and that we need to make key investments to help rebuild Manitoba's economy. So just can talk a little bit about that mindset that you had to kind of go in this time as opposed to last year when you were, literally balancing the budget.
Yeah, no, great point, Chuck. And this year, we really think, and I think all governments are this way. Right now is the time to invest money, right? To protect Manitobans, the health and education and all that sorts of stuff. Super, super important. We got to get through the pandemic. That's the number one thing, right? And you can put all these other areas that I've got in the budget aside. You can't get people vaccinated. You can't get back to normal. That's the utmost important thing that we've got to do to get businesses and individuals' lives back. So that's the really most important thing. So that was our number one goal. The second goal, what we want to do is really take a look post-pandemic, right? Once we are back to normal, how can we build the economy? How can we grow the pie, I guess, if you will? We got some pretty good growth numbers that we anticipate in future years, but we got to grow the economy. And we looked at a number of measures to do. Number one, there's going to be some supports. Some of the programs like the Bridge and the GAP program were good, I think, when the shutdowns happened, but we really want to have kind of growth incentives, the wage subsidy. Last summer, we did a lot of that. And we were leading the nation in kind of the recovery of that and went into, of course, the second wave of it. But we really took a look at these types of initiatives. We also took a look at, the sectors that have been hurt. Accommodation services, youth, women, specifically youth have been really impacted. So we identified some dollars there, more sector specific focus, and then a long-term focus of where we need to go as a province, have a plan. We do anticipate kind of a bit of a COVID deficit here over the next 2 years. And then, as soon as we can get through the pandemic, I think it's kind of back to normal in terms of our spending patterns. We have a meeting every week with the Minister Friedland and other finance ministers. And so it's a real helpful meeting because we get to, ministers of finance are dealing with the same thing, whether you're in Ontario, BC, or at the federal government level. And it's been very effective in working with the business community like yourself and others to kind of get that long-term view of it. So I don't know if that answers your question directly. Yeah. Addressing the immediate needs and really focus in the long term.
I think it does. Just and I've said this repeatedly as well, that any kind of economic recovery, immunization is first and foremost. Is until businesses can be open that have been operating at less than 50% for the better part of over a year. That's got to be job one, is to how do we get them whole again so that they can operate is their number one priority. So we've got some questions. So we've got some partners, and we're going to go to the video. I feel like a big TV host here. We're go to the video. We're going to play from the Manitoba Egg Farmers. The chair, Catherine Croker-Clausen, has a question for you.
My name is Catherine, and my family and I farm in southeastern Manitoba. We are egg and grain farmers. I'm also the chair of the board of directors for Manitoba Egg Farmers and represent 170 egg and pullet farmers. Thank you for the opportunity to ask a few questions. Egg farmers responded quickly and pivoted in the past year to ensure that there were local, fresh, nutritious eggs available when they were needed. What can we do as farmers to help ensure Manitoba's economic recovery in the next year?
Well, thank you. Great question. I think Manitoba has a pretty good advantage. I guess I'll move into kind of the manufacturing and food processing. It's just been, we went through a bit of the numbers here before, but there's been hundreds of millions of dollars being invested in places like Simplot and Riquette and other things like that. So I really think we have an advantage with the food processing and pea processing and all that sorts that are there. We've got a protein advantage. And I think even, if you look at things like, the way people are eating nowadays, they're eating healthier. We really have an advantage to an opportunity, I think, here to take it up. If you look at, our exports this year, our exports in the United States went down by about 10%, but it went up by about 81% to China and to Japan. And that's largely based on food processing. So we'd like to do as much as we can. Part of that is investing in wastewater types of systems to make sure people have capacity. But we think kind of having a long-term strategy, a protein strategy, is something that's going to really build the agricultural sector.
Minister Fielding, one of the other questions that came to us was from our other partner, which is Rogers, and they're asking the question that with the recently announced $3.6 billion in pandemic debt, what sort of financial impacts can Manitoba businesses expect as the government of Manitoba moves to reduce those deficits?
$3.6 billion in debt. You're saying the debt that we've taken on?
From the pandemic, yeah, just specific pandemic debt.
Yeah, well, number one, debt servicing charges, we're about $1 billion a year. So that's $1 billion you don't have on things like, paying for education, social services, business supports, infrastructure. So we've got to address our deficit. We think we have a pretty good plan to get ourselves out of deficit position in an 8-year time period. I think we're going to beat that, and kind of address kind of the deficits we've taken on. A lot of the deficit is related to some of the hydro projects, right? So there's $10 billion of issues with different kind of generating stations that are there, but I think hopefully in the long term. So how will that impact people? Well, if you're paying debt servicing charges, you don't have money to support these other types of initiatives. We are looking to, and we have in this budget, try to reduce taxes, for education property taxes that have impact on businesses as well as individuals. Payroll tax, we want to be more competitive in an area. So, we're in a cycle where we are going to run a deficit because right now, because we need to protect Manitobans, but we have a long-term plan to get ourselves in balance over an 8-year time period. And if you look at our track record over the first 4 years, we've beaten our expectations every year. In fact, we had a plan to get ourselves back 8 years into balance. We did it 4 years in advance. So I think we're going to follow that same track record. But right now is the time to invest in protecting Manitobans.
And so a follow-up question to that as well, and Rogers throws in, is sort of what impact will that COVID-related deficit spending have on other government priorities, including the proposed changes to the education property tax, plans to build the new schools, retail sales tax reduction, and investments in healthcare?
Well, if you've got less money, you're paying more in debt servicing, of this, right? You have less money to spend on other priorities. Right now, we've taken an approach that we need to make these investments. We need to provide, tax relief. We need to make, tax changes to give business support. We need to do things like sector-driven initiatives, and we also need to do the tax roll. So we really try to focus in on is the main areas. There hasn't been a big expenditure increases in some of the smaller departments, but things for health and education, social services, infrastructure, we've seen big movement. We think that growth, if you get the growth once the pandemic is over, you're going to be able to grow yourself out of a deficit. So that's really part of the plan going forward. And that's why we like this, advance Manitoba, right, to make sure that we've got a long-term plan to grow the economy.
One of the things every time, and I kind of threw out a comment yesterday, I've been covering these things for 25 years, going to lockup and looking at budgets, and there's always one or two little surprises that I notice in a budget, and I think, I didn't expect that to come. And I think for most people, this year's was the 50% education property tax rebate to both residential and farm owners. That, this is something that organizations like ourselves and others have been calling to get education off property tax for a long time. Your government had made a commitment to it, but had been looking at doing it over a 10-year time frame. So maybe just talk a little bit about what was the urgency that you looked at to really speed that process up this time around and throw that into this year's budget?
Well, we just think that people, the unemployment rate, look at the unemployment rate. People are hurting really from the economy, right? So we wanted to supercharge kind of our commitment to reduce the education property tax. There is a bit of a stimulus effect, right? If you're getting your check for $500 or whatever your check may be from the government, you are going to spend some of it. There's no doubt about it. There is a stimulus. I'm not saying you're going to get all that money back, but we do think that people need a break this year. And we think that it is a COVID deficit. It's 2 years of this, then we get back to normal levels. So that was the thinking to supercharge it. We always like to do some surprises here in the budget. I think we did that with the PST a year earlier. But our government's really focused in on, cutting taxes, getting a little bit, making life a little bit more affordable for individuals. And so we've really tried to do that throughout our whole time, 5 years in government.
We're going to go to the video again. So we've got another question from Catherine from the Manitoba Egg Farmers, who's got a secondary question. So we'll roll the tape and play Catherine's second question.
We all realized over this past year during the pandemic just how important connection has been. What is the government doing to keep rural farm families like mine connected with better internet access and maintained roads?
Yeah, I think the question was roads and broadband service. So maybe I'll unpack the roads. Number one, we made a pretty substantial increase in our strategic infrastructure. It's gone from 1.8 million to 2.1 million, and that's roads as well as kind of building schools and other things that are there. The third, I guess, was in terms of our horizon for the roads budget. If you talk to the Heavy Construction Association, they want to make sure there's predictability of it. So there's going to be $500 million we've committed to for a 3-year time period to make sure we're getting the roads rebuilt. We think that's a part of that kind of long-term advantage to get Manitobans working again. And I think the first question was on broadband. And so you probably have seen.
Yeah, I think what we're looking for, and one of the challenges, there's no question that's come up, through this pandemic, is just the importance of digital infrastructure.
Yeah.
Whether it's, we got kids learning at home, you got people working at home, you got businesses, and specifically in rural Manitoba. So, what kind of commitment can we look for to improve digital infrastructure? And specifically, this is, a rural Manitoba issue.
Yeah, no, obviously broadband is really important. And so you probably heard of the dark fiber piece that Manitoba Hydro has throughout the province. So there's an RFP that was put out. That will be the results that will come out very soon, and that will expand broadband services really across the province. Again, it's there'll be, I guess, Minister Helwer as well as Minister Wharton will be kind of announcing that in the coming weeks. But that's a kind of a long-term strategy to provide more broadband network. Everyone's online now, specifically in rural and northern communities. You need this. So I think you're going to be pretty happy with that, and we'll be releasing the results over the next little while. Who won the bid?
Just as a follow-up, I think to the highways capital that you talked about, and sort of the no less than 500 million for the next 3 years. One of the questions that's come across is that through a published annual and 5-year investment program with projects expected in those years is recognized as best practice in capital program management and as the practice at other levels of government. What's sort of the time frame in terms of when Manitoba Infrastructure will publish that annual and 5-year budget for that highway capital investment?
Yeah, that's right. And so you're right. Infrastructure hasn't had a 5-year plan. So we committed to that. Minister Schuler has been working with the Heavy Construction Association. So I believe it'd be in year. He'd have more details on that, but we want to make sure you have a 5-year plan of where we're going with that. So we think it's important to make investments in there. So Minister Schuler will be coming out with that in the near distant future.
One of the other issues that's been raised as well as, and there's a question that's come from one of our people that's watching right now, is just, the challenges obviously with personal care homes, including infrastructure and staffing levels. And the question is, how does this budget support our most vulnerable residents in personal care homes in Manitoba?
Yeah, well, number one, obviously there was a tragedy that happened at the Maples Care Center. People probably know all about. I'd like to say that it was isolated here in Manitoba, but of course that happened really throughout the country. And so I think they're looking at models, kind of a safer models, kind of single units. So we did allocate about $10 million more for these centers. We're building 120 new kind of safer units in Steinbach and Carmen area. There's a lot of discussions that are happening at the federal level, at the finance minister's table, as well as the health minister's table. And I think there's a real interest from the federal government. Our hope is that we would get kind of healthcare funding, kind of unencumbered, that we can, address wait times. The federal government is very much interested in some of the longer term care. So we've submitted some proposals to the federal government, so we'll see where those go. But I do think that will be substantial further investments from the federal government. And we're going to want to work with them when that happens to make sure that our long-term care centers are safe.
Another question that we've got that's come across, just that, when we talk about infrastructure, there's concerns about, current rate of inflation, shortage of construction materials, a number of things that could be challenging for that. Just is there any sense, from the province, just in regards to, additional, where things seem to be going in regards to the additional cost of those construction materials?
I don't know if I can talk necessarily about the cost of construction materials, although if anyone has bought lumber lately, they kind of know where the costs have gone for those types of construction. That's why we think it's important to have a 3-year window to provide at least $500 million. Like what happens is a lot of the industries, they want to, make sure they've got enough capital, employees kind of hired on for that. So I think that having predictability is really, really important. The other piece is this ISIP funding. So people know there's a federal provincial infrastructure program that's in place. There's a lot of projects in rural and northern Manitoba that are focused in on that. We've committed to get all this infrastructure dollars out this year. So I think it's an extra, I think it's $107 million this year. There'll be wastewater projects that will be done and other things that are related to this. So we want to get shovels in the ground. So we're working with municipalities. We've submitted all our proposals to Ottawa, and Ottawa needs to make the final decision. I think there seems to be a federal election in the air, so who knows? Sometimes that sparks some announcements from the federal level on these types of things. But we're committed to getting all our ISIP dollars out the door.
Minister, I know we're running out of time, and you've got question period in about half an hour. Need to prepare for that. So maybe just sort of one final question is, one of the things that, our organization and organizations like the Winnipeg Chamber and the Business Council have been asking for quite some time is the tax competitiveness, review, something that hasn't been done in Manitoba in close to 20 years or even longer. So, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you envision that process working, and sort of maybe a timeline and a time frame in terms of, how quickly you'd like to get moving on this initiative.
Yeah, it's something, obviously, I know your association, the Winnipeg Chamber, the Business Council, I know there's some work that was being done with the Business Council and the Chartered Accountants, using the wrong terminology, but with the Chartered Accountants. And so we've committed to this. We think it makes sense. In a long-term basis, you got to make sure we're competitive on a tax basis. We haven't developed the terms of reference, but we certainly want to work with organizations like yourself and the Business Council and anyone that's interested in these types of areas to put together some sort of a terms of reference, what that may look like.
Minister Fielding, it's always a pleasure to have a discussion with you, and I appreciate you taking the time. And my hope is that one of these days we'll get to do this in person again and get back to the events that we used to do, and we can have breakfast with you and have a more fulsome discussion in person. But I really appreciate you taking the time with us today. And with that, we'll throw it back to Peggy May for some closing comments.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks for moderating the Q&A, and very special thanks to Minister Scott Fielding for his review of the budget for fiscal year 2021-22. The Manitoba Chambers of Commerce has been carrying a resolution in our policy book since 2014 that asks government to work to achieve and maintain a balanced budget. We understand that a balanced budget is not likely to occur for a few years given our circumstances, so this policy will be expired this year. Instead, we will put forward a new policy for our network's consideration that asks our government for specific commitments related to the pandemic's management, immunization campaign, and economic recovery strategy while enhancing our province's preparedness for future possible events like the pandemic. On behalf of the Manitoba Chambers of Commerce, thank you again to 6P Marketing, Rogers, and Manitoba Egg Farmers. To all our participants, thank you for joining us today, and let's all continue focusing on the fundamentals so we can reduce our risk of COVID-19. Thank you again to Minister Fielding for your budget 2021-22 presentation today. Up next in our Manitoba Pulley Power Hour series, we'll host Honorable Ralph Eichler, Minister of Economic Development and Training, on May the 4th to talk economic recovery and investments in digital enhancements, local support campaigns, and employee reskilling. Registration will open right away on jointhechamber.ca, and you can watch your email for the invitation. The following week, on Thursday, May the 13th, we'll host our Manitoba Economic Summit and the 90th Annual General Meeting. This virtual event will be free of charge and chock full of great content, panelists, and keynotes. Watch our newsletter for details, and we hope you'll join us to celebrate Manitoba Chambers of Commerce 90 years of service to Manitoba business community. Stay safe, everyone.